For everyone else in town, it's just another ordinary morning. But for high school student and artist Mark, it's the same day again. He's trapped in a time loop, repeating this day so many times that he knows every little detail by heart. Every morning, he watches his mom leave for work, then sits down for breakfast with his dad, Daniel, and his sister, Emma. He already knows exactly what they'll say. Emma invites him to her soccer match. He declines, as always. Daniel struggles with his crossword puzzle, but Mark already knows all the answers. His day follows the same routine. He rides through town on his bike, predicting every move people make. Sometimes he interferes, like snatching a phone from a distracted driver to stop an accident. Other times, he just has fun with it, buying a lottery ticket with the winning numbers or even joyriding an excavator. School? He's long stopped bothering with that. But every day, without fail, he stops by the same street corner to help a girl named Phoebe with directions. He has a huge crush on her, but despite endless chances, he still can't seem to start a real conversation. Later in the day, he heads to the local pool, always ready to save Phoebe from getting hit by a stray ball or tripping over. Sometimes he even walks her home, but she never says yes when he asks to hang out afterward. When frustration kicks in, he visits his friend Henry, who's stuck on a video game level. Mark tries to bring up his problem in a roundabout way, asking what Henry would do if he were stuck in a time loop. Henry's answer is simple: I get the girl. Infinite chances mean you have to get it right eventually. Henry warns that being stuck in the time loop would drive anyone crazy. Endless repetition and isolation would take a toll. But Mark brushes it off, insisting he'd feel like the king of the world. Deep down, though, even he has moments of loneliness, especially when he avoids having a serious talk with his dad. Every day, Mark keeps trying to impress Phoebe at the pool. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happens. Margaret suddenly steps in and catches the ball before it hits Phoebe. Mark is stunned. This wasn't supposed to happen. Curious, he follows Margaret, but she gets into a car and drives away before he can talk to her. Determined to find her, Mark searches in every loop. He waits by the pool, but she never returns. He even tries calling the number on a missing dog flyer she dropped, but it leads nowhere. Then, by sheer luck, he spots something unusual at a restaurant: a manga book and a $100 bill left on a table. It has to be her. Mark rushes outside and almost loses hope when he thinks she left on a bus, until he finally sees her resting against a wall. He approaches, awkward but determined, and asks if she's in the loop too. Margaret confirms it, but she's not interested in making friends. To her, being stuck is like being the only person awake in a sleeping world. Not wanting to lose the only person who understands him, Mark convinces her to stick around for a bit by showing her some of the weird things he's discovered in town, like a dog stealing a man's phone. When Margaret gets an urgent call, she has to leave, but Mark persuades her to share her number so they can find each other again. As the clock strikes midnight and the day resets, Mark desperately tries to remember her number, and thankfully he does. He starts experimenting with different hairstyles, sending her pictures. She ignores him at first, but when he finally asks to meet up, she agrees. Slowly, they start opening up. Mark confesses he's supposed to be in summer school, but has barely attended. For the first time in a long time, something feels different. Maybe being stuck in the loop isn't so lonely after all. Mark dreams of going to art school, but his parents are determined to push him into honors math. The worst part? The time loop keeps repeating on the same day his dad, Daniel, wants to discuss his future. Meanwhile, Margaret, who's in AP classes, dreams of becoming an astronaut. As they relive the loop over and over, they share the wild things they've been up to. Mark has hopped onto a moving freight train and ridden his bike straight through school. Margaret, on the other hand, cranked her chess app to the hardest level, though she still can't beat it. She also borrowed her friend's car and taught herself how to drive. But her favorite part of the loop is something out in the forest, so she takes Mark there to show him. They watch as a bird swoops down over the lake and effortlessly catches a fish. Mark is mesmerized. After spending time together, Margaret drives Mark home, but just as she leaves, she gets another urgent phone call from a guy named Jared. Mark is curious, but doesn't ask. On the next reset, Mark takes Margaret to watch the skate rats at the park. Most of them are terrible, but one skater lands a trick so smoothly that Mark finds it just as fascinating as the bird. They then drive a steamroller through town while Mark tries to figure out who Jared is. Margaret only says he's a med student and changes the subject. Later, while stuffing themselves with fast food and ice cream, Mark shares his realization. Most of life is just ordinary, but in the loop, they get to focus on the little moments that make it extraordinary. This sparks an idea. Why not find and collect all the tiny, perfect things in their town? Margaret isn't convinced. Unlike Mark, she doesn't want to seize the day, she just wants to get through it. But when he reminds her that they only have each other and should make the loop meaningful, she agrees. Their first mission? Hiding random dollar bills in a store for people to find. As they do, they discuss wild theories about the fourth dimension. Margaret doesn't think time is the answer. She believes they might just be shadows of people from a higher dimension. To prove her point, she sketches a 4D cube on the store window, showing Mark what it might look like. And so, their journey to uncover life's hidden magic begins. After that, they spend their days searching for cool and unexpected moments around town. They appreciate anything unique. A joyful elderly woman dancing after winning a card game, a man appearing to grow wings when a van stops behind him, or a janitor pausing his work to play the piano. Occasionally, Margaret drags Mark to the library to teach him math. But no matter what they do, Margaret always leaves when she gets a call from Jared. Even though she doesn't want the day to end, and even wishes time could stay frozen forever, she still goes. That evening, Mark messes with his dad by giving him joke answers about his future and showing off a tattoo. The next morning, determined to uncover the mystery of Jared, he looks him up online. He finds a photo of a hospital staff member and suddenly feels small, unimportant. Unsure how to handle his growing feelings for Margaret, he seeks advice from Henry. Henry suggests a stealth date. Start with casual hanging out, gradually add romantic touches, and wait for the perfect moment to kiss her. Mark goes all in, after careful planning, and a few bribes to the kids in the art department. He surprises Margaret with a special setup at the school gym, a recreation of Tranquility Base, the famous lunar landing site. They spend the day pretending to be astronauts, eating space food, and even riding a bicycle through the school corridors. Later, they head to Mark's house, where he shares a bit about his family. His mom works long hours, so because of the time loop, he hasn't seen her in what feels like forever. His dad, meanwhile, recently quit his job to write a book about the Civil War. But when the conversation shifts to Margaret's parents, she avoids the topic. Instead, they end up watching a movie. While looking around his room, Margaret finds a hand-drawn map on his desk, marking all the special moments they've discovered around town. She's impressed. When Mark admits he redraws it every morning, hoping to find a pattern, but never does, she looks at him in a way that makes him wonder. Maybe she sees something he doesn't. As Mark and Margaret sit close together, sharing a sweet moment over the map, Mark leans in to kiss her. But Margaret pulls back, saying she can't. Confused, Mark wonders if it has something to do with Jared, suspecting there's something she's not telling him. This frustrates Margaret, and she snaps. She explains that since they're stuck together, they shouldn't do anything that could ruin things. Their perfect thing collection should be enough. Heartbroken, Mark agrees to just be friends. Margaret then leaves to take her usual phone call. The next reset, Mark wakes up in a bad mood. Unlike before, he doesn't bother making his usual predictions during breakfast. Instead, he asks his dad how his mom is doing. He only gets a short, vague answer, fine. Later, Mark heads to Henry's place, hoping for a sympathetic ear. But Henry doesn't understand what's going on, which only makes Mark more frustrated. When Mark gets home, his dad, Daniel, tries to have a serious talk with him about his future. But Mark has had enough. He snaps, yelling that he has no future because time is broken. He also lashes out at his dad, calling it unfair that he can't go to art school while Daniel quit his job to write some midlife crisis book. Furious, Mark storms off to his room, only to be annoyed by Emma's violin practice. He goes to her room instead and asks her to stop. As she puts the violin away, she asks how the talk with her dad went. Mark bitterly admits that he hates how Daniel got to chase his dreams, but he can't do the same. That's when Emma drops a bombshell. Daniel didn't quit. He was fired. Not because he messed up, but because his company didn't need him anymore. He just won't admit it because he's ashamed. Their mom is also upset about it, but she doesn't say anything because it would be too cruel. And as for art school, their dad isn't against it. He just can't afford it right now. Emma then calls Mark out for being too self-absorbed to notice what's really going on. Feeling guilty, Mark asks about her soccer game. She tells him they lost 3-0. In the next reset, Mark goes to see his algebra teacher, Mr. Pepper. But the teacher doesn't even recognize him, because Mark has only shown up to class twice. Mark is desperate to figure out what's causing the time loop, so he shares a bunch of theories he found online, from wormholes to magic curses. But Mr. Pepper dismisses them all, except for the idea of singularity, which he admits might actually be possible. That's all Mark needs to hear. He's convinced that if he just gets on a plane and flies away, he can escape the loop. Later, when he meets Margaret, they realize they've already experienced every perfect moment in town, yet time still hasn't reset. Mark grows frustrated, but Margaret doesn't see the problem. To her, they have total freedom in a world frozen in time. But Mark is done with the loop. He wants to create things that last, build a career, and live beyond a single repeating day. To take his mind off it, Margaret drags him to a show house, where they go wild, smashing everything inside. It's fun, but Mark still can't shake his need to break free. Margaret argues that adulthood is just another endless routine, so why bother escaping? But Mark disagrees. Time is precious because once it's spent, you can't get it back. His words hit Margaret hard, and she finally agrees to try his plan. The next morning, they board a plane to Tokyo. But just as the flight is about to take off, Margaret panics. While Mark is distracted with a sleep mask, she sneaks away. By the time he realizes it's too late, the plane is in the air. She leaves him a text apologizing. Mark spends the flight creating art, bracing himself as they cross the international date line. But nothing changes. He wakes up to the same day again. This time, though, something feels different. Instead of frustration, he approaches the day with a calmer attitude. His sister reacts more warmly to him at breakfast, which has never happened before. Encouraged, he makes an effort to be kinder, even chatting with Daniel about his book. Later, he joins his dad to watch Emma's soccer match, and this time, they actually score. Inspired by these small changes, Mark starts seeing the loop in a new way. Instead of escaping, maybe he can use it to make things better, not just for himself, but for everyone. Mark gives away the winning lottery ticket to a random woman, uses an excavator to save a cat stuck in a tree, dances with an elderly woman, claps along to the janitor's music, and even attends his algebra class for once. Thanks to all the tutoring from Margaret, he finally impresses Mr. Pepper. He also spends more quality time with Henry and Emma, and even tries to pull off a stair trick with the skaters, though he ends up falling and breaking his wrist. At the hospital, while getting his wrist cast, Mark is surprised to see Margaret there. Curious, he follows her and finally uncovers her secret. Her mother, Greta, is dying of cancer. The next time the day resets, Mark wakes up with tears in his eyes. This time, instead of rushing through the morning, he runs outside and hugs his mom before she leaves for work. Later, while playing video games with Henry, he opens up about Margaret. He once believed this was his love story and that he was the hero, but he realizes now it has always been Margaret's story. She doesn't want time to repeat for fun. She just doesn't want to lose her mother. Meanwhile, Margaret is with Greta, confessing that she's been thinking about a boy and regrets messing things up. Greta gently reminds her that it's never too late to fix things. Later, Margaret is playing chess in her usual spot, where the street art gives her angel wings in the perfect moment. That's when she spots something: the missing dog, casually wandering the neighborhood. She rescues him, but hesitates to return him to his owner, knowing he'll just be lost again when the day resets. Mark was right. No matter how much they fix, everything falls apart again. Instead of fighting the cycle, she shifts her focus. She visits Henry and finally teaches him how to beat the video game. Watching the game character die over and over, only to eventually find the key to move forward, sparks something in her. Death is painful, but refusing to face it means losing yourself too. Then, something clicks. She remembers Mark talking about perfect moments forming a pattern he couldn't figure out. Inspired, she grabs a map of the town and starts marking all those little moments. She spends hours revisiting them, looking for the connection. But something still feels off. The missing piece? Time. Margaret uses a string to map out the perfect moments in time, creating a 3D model. Its shadow forms a 4D cube, but something is missing. After some calculations, she realizes the final moment will happen at 7 p.m. by the pool. In the next loop, she visits Greta, worried about losing her. But Greta reassures her. She'll be okay. She tells Margaret that if she wants to break free, she needs to stop fearing the end and start embracing life's perfect moments. Just before 7 p.m., Margaret heads to the pool and finds Mark waiting. She tells him about the pattern, but Mark has already made up his mind. He knows about Greta and refuses to leave the loop. He can't abandon her. Touched by his words, Margaret reveals a secret. The night before the loop began, she learned Greta didn't have much time left. In that moment of pain, she wished for time to stop, and somehow her wish came true. Mark appeared, though she never understood why. But now she does. When the time comes, she won't have to face it alone. Margaret realizes they've been asleep while the rest of the world kept living. It's time to wake up. She declares this their final perfect moment and kisses Mark. Later, Margaret visits the hospital one last time to say goodbye to Greta. Then, hand in hand with Mark, she steps outside, waiting for midnight. As the clock strikes 12, the rain begins to fall. They look up, realizing it's over. They're finally free. The next morning, they find the missing dog and return it to its owner together.